Between Ukraine's historic defiance and Russia's brutal insistence on war, the rest of the world is struggling to understand what is underway and where it leads. To date, all attempts at mediation have failed. Anne Applebaum is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and staff writer for The Atlantic, who's written several books on Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe in the 20th century. Her most recent book is Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. And she joins us now from Washington, D.C. And Anne, we are delighted to have you back on TVO here. How are you managing these days?
I'm fine. I'm a little overwhelmed, but I'm fine. Thank you.
I understand why you and so many others are overwhelmed at the state of the world these days. I want to start by reading something that you wrote earlier this year, and then we'll come out of this and chat. You did write, in fact, the best time to give Ukraine more significant military support would have been 8 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 3 years ago. If the U.S. had done so, then there would be a lesser threat or no threat of Russian invasion now, because Putin would calculate the risks differently. But Americans didn't step in, because President Barack Obama never took Russia seriously, because Trump was on Putin's side in the global contest between autocracy and democracy, and because Democrats and Republicans alike have had other things to think about since Biden took office. Now, time has passed a few months since you wrote that, and I'm wondering whether you regard it at all differently. Might things be different now had Washington taken different decisions over the past many years?
Yes, I do believe things might be different now if Washington had taken different decisions, and not only in Ukraine. Our failure to react when Russia annexed Crimea, at least to react with sufficient force, our failure to react in the years earlier when Russia invaded Georgia, our failure to react when Russia murdered people in Berlin and London and Salisbury, used poisonous chemicals to attack people in the street. Our failure in general to take Russia seriously and to listen carefully to what Putin was saying and to understand what kind of state he was building and what his goals were, which he's been very clear about for many years, all of that I regret enormously. I feel that he made a judgment that the West would not defend Ukraine, that he would not be severely sanctioned for invading Ukraine, and that he would somehow get away with it. He would reincorporate Ukraine into Russia, and the world would move on. Had he not made that calculation, had he been more afraid either of a military response or of a different kind of economic response or response in other spheres, he might have acted differently.
Putin clearly miscalculated this time, but I'm wondering what do you think was underpinning the West's lack of response to every other moment in history when it could have done more over the past many years?
I think that the West became complacent after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We told ourselves that we had created this thing called the liberal world order, that there were rules and norms, that there were institutions to manage conflict, that nobody would break those rules because there was no reason to break them because everybody understood them and abided by them. We convinced ourselves that these rules applied to everybody and not just to Europe and the United States and Canada. And I think we failed to see that the rise in autocracy in Russia and in other countries meant that a new breed of leader was coming to power who did not respect these rules and who began to see that really they weren't enforced. Actually, the invasion of Crimea did not win you some kind of special sanction. You were not excluded from the club of nations. You were not able, you didn't have to stop trading. You could carry on. Yet we made this, we didn't see that, we didn't acknowledge it. We were too confident that our own values were everybody's values. I think it was the universalism of the West is one of the most attractive things about it. The thing that we believe that human rights are for everybody and democracy is for everybody. But we sometimes make the mistake of taking that a step farther and assuming that everybody already believes that too. We want people to be able to have these things. We think everybody can, but that doesn't mean that the leader of every country is so convinced.
And why do you think, having turned a blind eye, if you like, to all of those moments in history you just enumerated, what is it about the invasion of Ukraine that was clearly a bridge too far for the West this time?
I think the unprovoked nature of the invasion, that certainly from our point of view, there's no rational explanation for it. I think the bravery of the Ukrainians and of their president has impressed on people the fact that this is a nation that wants to protect its sovereignty and cares about it. I really think we might be looking at a different kind of story had that not been the case. But particularly in the Western world, where people are, and particularly in Europe, where people are sensitive to the lessons of history, the sight of a smaller country fighting for democracy and freedom and sovereignty against a larger dictatorship brings back a lot of memories and reminds people of the Second World War. Even the photographs out of Ukraine, if you make them black and white, they could be 1939, or 1941. And they evoke some memories, in people. And I think there's something particular about the Ukrainian cause. In the West, we've been fighting kind of culture war for the last decade between liberalism on the one hand and some kind of nationalism on the other. And the Ukrainians are showing us something different. This is a kind of muscular, patriotic defense of a liberal, open society. And I think that has a really strong bipartisan appeal, not only in the United States, but in the other democracies. We instinctively understand it in a way that other wars, civil wars, have been much harder to understand.
Now, pretty clearly, the last 3 weeks have not gone according to Putin's playbook. No one can know what's going on inside his head, but methinks he probably thought this would be over after a few days. And here we are a few weeks later, and the Ukrainians are simply not cooperating with him in the way they want. Why do you think it's gone so badly for Russia so far?
Well, first, I should say that it's not a guess that Putin thought it would be over quickly. We know he thought it would be over quickly. A couple of days after the invasion, an article that was meant to appear in several Russian websites and online publications accidentally appeared in one or two of them. And the article was a kind of triumphant description. Now we are in Kiev. Now a new epoch has begun. Now we will reunite Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. And we enter a new era of Russia and its relationships with Europe and so on and so on. So we know they thought it was going to be fast because that's what they were planning for, and that's what they said, and that's what their propaganda said, even if it proved to be incorrect. I think Putin is almost. I mean, if you want a lesson in why autocracy is a worse political system than democracy, the isolation of Putin, the fact that he's surrounded only by people who agree with him, the fact that he had so little knowledge of Ukraine and so little contact with Ukrainians meant that he underestimated how much they were going to resist and how much they were going to fight back. He may also have understood less about his own army than you would expect. I mean, there are a lot of stories now coming out about corruption in the Russian army. Generals were lying about how many men they had at the front. They said they weren't using conscripts, but in fact they were. They may not have been maintaining their vehicles the way they were supposed to do. So there were a lot of things that were not told to Putin or not conveyed to him because he was not interested in hearing bad news. And he himself is untransparent, and he's surrounded by untransparent institutions. It's not clear who has any influence over him, who has a formal relationship with him. And he made the mistake of guessing wrong.
Well, in fact, we've got some other examples here of some curious decision-making. For example, he's asked China to help out militarily for some equipment. He apparently has looked to Syria and Libya for mercenaries to help. There are suggestions that 8 generals have been removed from their positions, 2 senior FSB intelligence officers arrested. How much of this do you think we can take at face value, and how much of it is the fog of war?
Some of it is the fog of war. I mean, we don't really know, whereas we do know, by the way, what Putin says about himself and his goals, which are very clear. We don't know that much about what he really says to China. And it isn't clear to me yet that this Syrian part of the story is anything more than propaganda. We'll see in the coming days. I mean, we do know that he's brought Chechens into the conflict. But I just don't know what kind of numbers we're talking about coming from Syria. So some of it is that, and some of it may reflect a real attempt to do a reset in the middle of the war, to start again, to use some different allies, to change tactics. I mean, it seems to me the most important change in tactics, and the most horrible and brutal aspect of this war is the fact that they've reverted to almost, as one Ukrainian soldier described it, I mean, it's almost World War II style tactics. They've reverted to mass and indiscriminate bombing of civilians. And so they're hitting apartment blocks, kindergartens, hospitals. They may even be hitting hospitals on purpose, which we know they did in Syria. And it seems to be there's a deliberate attempt to demoralize the population, in the most brutal way possible. And that's been, shifting to those tactics. This is not a surgical strike. It wasn't a blitzkrieg. Instead, we have this attempt to just wear down the Ukrainians, which is extraordinarily ugly. And as I say, reminiscent of really the worst pages of past European history. There was a tweet the other day from someone named Kamil Galiev, which has been gaining some currency, and I'll just read this to you and get you to react to it. He wrote, "A czar absolutely can rule while being hated, but he can't rule without being respected, and a shameful defeat destroys any respect." Do you suspect that we are any closer to a locally organized conspiracy to get rid of Putin? So I'm afraid I think some of that is wishful thinking on our part. There is no mechanism to change the leader of Russia. And not only that, even if there were such a mechanism, we don't know how the next leader would be chosen or who would choose it. At least in the Soviet era, there was a Politburo. So there were some intermediate institutions. There were other means of talking to Moscow. There were, back channels and all kinds of special ways we could get in touch with people other than the leader. We don't really have that now. And because of that, we don't have really all that much knowledge of Putin's inner circle. We know that he spent a lot of the last 2 years in some kind of COVID bunker, that he made people spend 2 weeks in quarantine before even coming in to see him. And we don't know even how often he speaks to his generals or to his FSB colonels. So it's we are operating in a vacuum, and there, it has to be said that there's no tradition in Russia of a military coup. It's not something that you see a lot of in Russian history. The one precedent people sometimes talk about is the arrest of Beria, who was Stalin's secret police chief after he died. And that was really done by getting him into a room with the rest of the Politburo and then having him arrested and taken away. But that method seems difficult in these circumstances where there isn't a Politburo to get to be in the room with. So although I know it sounds like a nice way to end the war, or not nice, but that was the wrong word, but a kind of convenient way for us to end the war, I don't have any evidence right now that it will happen. How about this? If memory serves, there was a kind of it was a direct line, like a red phone between the Kremlin and the White House at the height of the Cold War to ensure that there could be direct communication if things got to DEFCON 1. Do you know whether or not such a line exists today? I'm sure such a line exists today. I just think that all the protocols and the rules around those kinds of communications have really fallen away. I remember the last proxy war that we fought with the Soviet Union was, I think it was Afghanistan in the 1980s, which was a completely different kind of conflict with no nuclear overtones and no existential threat to anybody. And all we were doing in that war was giving some stingers, actually, some sophisticated weapons to Afghan tribal leaders. So it was a completely different kind of war. And there used to be these, ways of talking, and there's, you're allowed to do X, but not Y. You can use this weapon, but that weapon would be escalatory. All that is gone, and we're now really operating in the dark. There are no rules, and we don't really know what Putin would consider to be escalatory and what would not be. And there has been a tendency to say that this is Vladimir Putin's war, and if only Putin were out of the way, things would be different. Do you believe that? I mean, to the extent that Putin is now a kind of isolated leader, yes, of course they would be different if he was not in charge. I do think that. But it's also wrong to imagine that this is just Putin's war. So Putin would not be able to carry out this war if he did not have the support of hundreds of thousands or even millions of Russians. And I don't just mean, the sort of propagandists you see on TV, but I mean the people who work in the so-called power ministries, in the army, in the secret police, the people who support him unthinkingly. I mean, there are layers and layers of people around him who at least say they support what he's doing, or at least too afraid to say that they're not. So this is not a This is not an action that could be carried out by one person.
Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, and his suggestion that this whole thing could go away if essentially somebody, quote unquote, took him out. What did you think of that?
It's a bit silly. I mean, it's just wishful thinking. And, there's really no evidence, A, that it can happen, or B, that would be the result.
And again, I don't know how much stock to put in this polling, but the Russian Public Opinion Research Center did just publish a poll saying that since the war began, Putin's personal approval rating in Russia has gone from 64 to 74.5%. Do you put stock in that?
No, I really don't. I mean, I don't think there's much polling in Russia that's very valuable. I mean, imagine, you're a taxi driver in Krasnoyarsk and somebody calls up and said, hello, I'm a polling company from Moscow. Do you support the president? Or what are you going to say? You're going to say, yes, Russia's a police state. People would be afraid to answer in any other way. There was some polling that was a little bit better done by the Navalny organization. This is the organization run by Alexei Navalny, who's currently in prison, but whose organization was the best organized and most effective opposition movement in Russia in many years. Most of its members have now left the country, but they did conduct a poll using an online technique they've used before. And that showed, this was in the first couple of weeks of the war, that showed that as some news about the war was creeping in, disapproval of it was going up. It wasn't remarkable numbers, but the direction was disapproval going up. And much depends on what happens and what Russians see and what they understand is happening. I mean, as we know, there's a kind of complete propaganda blackout there right now, and people are only told that any destruction that you see is the Ukrainians' fault. The Russians are only aiming to hit military targets. People are being given a completely different version of the war. And although some people can find an alternative, if you have a VPN and you know how to look online, most people are now cut off from any sources of information that would show them something different.
Let me ask you directly about the Ukrainians themselves. And that is there something, and you've written so many good books about Ukraine's history, and is there something in Ukraine's history that would explain the astonishing bravery against all odds that Ukrainians have shown thus far?
Yes. The Ukrainians have a memory of being assaulted by genocidal language and mass violence, and more than once. The piece of their history that I wrote a book called Red Famine, that was a description of the Ukrainian famine of 1932 and 1933, which was the cumulated effect of Stalin's paranoia about the Ukrainians. Interestingly, it has some parallels with Putin's paranoia about the Ukrainians. He thought of them as a kind of existential threat to power in Moscow. And he organized an artificial famine. Food was taken away from Ukrainians and confiscated. So this wasn't anything to do with the weather or insects or anything like that. And very close to 4 million people died. Then in the wake of that event, there was an attack on the entire Ukrainian intelligentsia and leadership. So writers, artists, poets, museum curators, university professors, even the Ukrainian Communist Party was decimated. So the memory of mass violence and the understanding of what it's like and the knowledge that it could be directed at them again is what's motivating people. And I should say that to my utter horror and to the horror of anybody who knows the history of this region, what the Russians are doing in the few towns that they have managed to occupy looks a lot like what the Red Army did when it occupied new territories in the 20th century. So we're hearing reports of mass violence, the arrest of mayors of towns, people being killed for no reason, cars being shot at. The use of mass violence and terror in order to terrorize the population, to remove its leadership, and to subjugate it. This is something that we've seen in that part of the world over and over again. And it is a horrifying, horrifying piece of history to be forced to repeat.
If we were having this conversation many, many decades ago, my next question about Ukrainian nationalism might have been answered by you differently than I suspect the answer you will give now. How has it changed over the intervening decades?
So the important thing to understand about modern Ukrainian nationalism as it's embodied in the current state and the current leadership is that although I don't think anybody ever uses this language in Ukraine, it's a kind of civic nationalism as opposed to an ethnic nationalism. And so what Zelensky represents, the president of Ukraine, who is of course Jewish, he represents an idea of Ukrainianness that can encompass both Russian and Ukrainian speakers. He himself is a native Russian speaker, and he's from a part of Ukraine that is mostly Russian speaking. It can include Jews. It can include people of other faiths. Anybody can be Ukrainian as long as they are loyal to the nation. And in this case, the modern definition of that means that you believe in Ukrainian democracy and you believe in Ukrainian integration with the West. So the idea of the nation has become bound up with that, bound up with the idea of democracy and bound up with the idea that we are not Russia. Not that we are not Russia in an ethnic sense, but that we are not an autocracy. We don't want kleptocracy. We want to maintain some greater freedom of speech. We want to be able to trade with who we want to trade with. And we will also, of course, we want our sovereignty. And if you believe in those things, then you're a Ukrainian. That's a wider definition of nationalism than one you might have found really anywhere in that part of the world 30 or 40 years ago.
I get asked this question all the time, so I'm going to put it to you because I saw the other day in one of Tom Friedman's columns in the New York Times that he talked about a dirty compromise, quote unquote, how Putin saves face, how to deal with the nuclear blackmail, and it essentially means accepting Russian rule in Crimea and in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, insisting, agreeing, consenting that Ukraine can never join NATO, and the U.S. and its allies agreeing to lift all the sanctions that are currently imposed on Russia. Do you see that as a way out of this?
I mean, there are a number of agreements that I can imagine people coming to as a way to end this conflict, but they are all have to be predicated on a Ukrainian victory. In other words, the Russians have to withdraw their troops. They have to end the war, and they have to pull them away, and they have to stop fighting. And I don't think there's going to be any real negotiation until that happens. I mean, this is not a civil war. This was not a conflict that had where both sides are somehow responsible. This was a brutal attack by Russia, and I don't think the Ukrainians are going to negotiate until the Russians are out. And at that point, there may be things they can agree to. I mean, the one point about, NATO is a kind of red herring, I think. I don't think the Ukrainians can ever agree to be neutral in the sense of having no weapons or having no army. This will be a country that, as long as there is Putin as the leader or somebody like Putin as the leader of Russia, then Ukraine will always feel itself to be under threat, and it will remain a heavily armed country with a large and powerful military. And so I don't think that's going to ever be negotiated away.
Let me get your take on this idea that was sort of in the air for a while, and that was to transfer the MiG-29s that Poland had to Ukraine, and that NATO would therefore replace those planes with, F-35s or something like that. It looked like that might happen for a bit, and then it sort of got scuttled. What do you think of that as a potential idea?
From what I understand, and this is not my area of expertise, but from what I understand, the MiGs would not make a huge difference to the war effort. That it would not be the thing that the Ukrainians really need, which is, closing the skies or having some way of stopping the cruise missiles and the bombing campaigns. And so, although they would offer a morale boost, and there are of course other things you can do with MiGs, then that would be, they could use them to shoot down Russian planes. I understood that they're not really a game changer, but although there are a number of things here, I don't really understand what's the difference between giving Ukraine MiGs and giving Ukraine javelins, and how come we can do the latter and not the former. That doesn't really make sense to me. It seems like what happened was that it was a combination of the Pentagon not liking the optics of the planes taking off from a U.S. airbase in Germany. That looked too much like U.S. engagement in the war, and possibly the Polish government, which fired many of its competent diplomats, making a mistake or misunderstanding something. So I'm not sure that it's that significant an issue. What really matters now is what kinds of weapons we are willing to give them, and are those going to be the ones that can help them win the war? What worries me is that not enough people in Washington, and maybe in Ottawa and London and Berlin and Paris, not enough people are thinking about how to win. It's very important that Ukraine wins, and that means that they expel the Russians from the towns that they occupy. Because Without that win, without that some kind of victory, we can disguise it as something else if it helps Russia leave and helps Putin, walk out. But without that, I think it's hard to imagine how there's really any long-lasting peace.
We're down to our last 30 seconds here, Anne, and I simply want to ask you, what, in your judgment, has been the most impressive thing from the Ukrainian side during this war?
I think Zelensky's speeches made with with a handheld video camera late at night from his office, in which he speaks like a normal person talking to friends, and he really gives people this sense of security and optimism. I think that has been the most remarkable thing about the war so far.
Well, he has the background to do that, doesn't he?
He does. He was a talented actor, although he was a different kind of actor. He was a comedian and not a great orator.
Apparently those skills are transferable. And we want to thank you so much for joining us for so much time here on TVO tonight. We are happy to remind people that your latest is called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. And we're glad that it's been able to bring you to our program tonight. Be well.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.